The third epistle of John, Supporting Ministers of the Gospel, Lesson 3. Introduction 1. In 3 John, we learn of the good that can be done when we receive and support those involved in the spreading of the gospel. 2. In this study, we shall consider A. The spiritual authority for supporting ministers of the gospel. B. The reason given by John for why we should be willing to do so. The spiritual authority for supporting ministers. A. As taught by Jesus. 1. Jesus himself was dependent upon others for support as he went about preaching. Luke 8 verses 1 through 3. 2. In sending out the 12 apostles, he taught that a worker is worthy of his food. Matthew 10 verse 5 through 10. 3. In sending out the 70, he said the laborer is worthy of his wages. Luke 10 verse 1 through 8. B. As taught by Paul. 1. Though for personal reasons he generally chose not to accept it, Paul defended the right of supporting ministers. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 3 through 14. A. Just as soldiers are not expected to support themselves. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 7a. B. Just as farmers and shepherds enjoy the fruits of their labors. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 7b. C. Just as the law illustrated with the command not to muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 8 through 10. D. From the principle of reasonableness, if one sows spiritual things, is it a great matter to reap material things? 1 Corinthians 9 verse 11. E. From the example of those serving in the temple who could partake of the offerings on the altar. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 13. F. Even the Lord commanded those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Perhaps a reference to Matthew 10 verse 10 and Luke 10 verse 7. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 14. G. Note, Paul chose not to receive such support under normal circumstances for the following reasons. 1. It was one of the few areas in which he could boast. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 15. 2. He could not boast in preaching the gospel, for he had been divinely commissioned. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 16 through 17. A. He must do it as a steward of Christ. B. He had no choice if he were to be saved. C. Such is not the case in those who preach today, unless the Lord appeared to us and commanded us to preach, as he did with Paul. It is something we do willingly and thereby have a reason to boast. 3. But that Paul might have a reason to boast, a reward, he freely gave up his right, authority to receive support in most cases. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 18. However, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 7 through 9 and Philippians 4 verses 10 through 16. 2. Another passage by Paul suggesting the scripturalness of supporting teachers. Galatians 6 verse 6. With the approval of Jesus and his apostle Paul, there should be no question about the scripturalness of supporting ministers of the gospel. Scriptural motivation for supporting ministers. A. It is a testimony of our faithfulness. 1. John wrote to Guinness, Beloved, you do faithfully. 3 John 5. 2. When we show hospitality to brethren and ministers, it demonstrates our faithfulness to the teachings of Christ and his apostles. B. It is a testimony to our love for one another. 1. John said of those who have received Guinness hospitality that they had borne witness of your love. 3 John verse 6a. 2. We demonstrate that we are keeping that new commandment first given to us by the Lord himself. John 13 verses 34 through 35. 3. In light of the value of such love, by this all will know. We ought to be grateful for opportunities to bear witness of our love for the brethren. C. It honors God. 1. John makes reference to sending such ministers on their journey in a manner worthy of God. 3 John 6. 2. Worthy of God means as benefits God. 3. Thus, the way in which we support ministers of God can be a reflection upon God Himself. A. If we do not consider His faithful ministers worthy of support, what do we think of God? B. If we honor and support those servants who faithfully proclaim His word, it is because we honor and respect the one they serve. D. It is a testimony to the lost. 1. The ones Jesus was encouraged to support were those who were taking nothing from the Gentiles. 3 John 7. A. This likely means they would not solicate support from the unsaved. B. Depending instead upon their brethren. 2. When ministers of the gospel solicate help from those lost souls they are trying to save, it sends a bad message. A. Perhaps the ministers are in it just for the money. B. If what they taught was worth anything, why don't their own followers support it? 3. When the gospel is offered free of cost, being supported wholeheartedly by those who know it best, it can be a powerful testimony of the value we place on it. E. It obeys God. 1 John, by inspiration of the Spirit of God, tells us we therefore ought to receive such. 3 John verse 8a. 2. Thus, supporting ministers of the gospel is not only an opportunity, but an obligation. A. Exhorted by Paul in Galatians 6 verse 6. B. Exchanged of material things for spiritual things considered reasonable by Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 verse 11. Also Romans 15 verses 26 through 27. F. It makes one a fellow worker for the truth. 1. As John concludes in verse 8, that we may become fellow workers for the truth. 2. When we support a teacher, we become co-workers in what they do. A. If we support teachers of error, we share in their evil deeds. 2 John 10 through 11. B. But when we support teachers of the gospel, we have fellowship in their work. Philippians 1 verses 3 through 5 and Philippians 4 verses 15 through 16. 3. As co-workers, we will one day enjoy the same rewards. Matthew 10 verses 40 through 42. Conclusion 1. So we not only have scriptural authority for supporting ministers of the gospel, but many reasons to do so. 2. The rapid spread of the gospel and growth of the early church was facilitated by such people as Jesus, along with A. Aquila and Priscilla, who allowed the churches to meet in their homes. Romans 15 verses 3 through 5a, 1 Corinthians 16 verse 19. B. Philemon, who let the church meet in his house and could be called upon without hesitation to provide lodging for the Apostle Paul. Philemon 1 through 2 and 22. 3. Today, as walls tumble down that once stood preventing the free course of the gospel, there is still a need to support those who preach the gospel. May the spirit and liberality of Jesus fill the hearts of those Christians and churches who would be fellow workers for the truth. The third epistle of John, supporting ministers of the gospel, lesson 3, the end.